draw England into a holy war and change the course of world history at the Battle of Kinsale. By the end of the 16th century, England had begun to exert its authority in Ireland. The Irish chieftains were too busy fighting each other to see the coming storm. One by one, the Gaelic lords were picked off and forced by fear or greed into the arms of the crown. There was some scattered resistance, but all it did was justify the crown's use of force. But not every Irish chieftain took the English shilling. In Ulster, a loose alliance of young guns led by Red Hugh O'Donnell, with the tacit support of his father-in-law, Hugh O'Neill, had succeeded in keeping the Queen's soldiers at bay. Elizabeth couldn't understand why Tyrone, her man in Ulster, hadn't crushed the rebellion.
I don't think that O'Neill was playing both sides. I think he was always on the Irish side, but he had to be seen by the government to be on their side, and as a result he sends out deliberate signals to misinform the government of his intentions all the time. He gives the impression that his followers, and indeed O'Donnell, are rebelling against the crown without his permission, but in fact he is generally manipulating them all behind the scenes.
Hugh O'Neill was born in Gaelic Ulster, though he was educated in the English Pale which surrounded Dublin. There, as a teenager, he was fostered to the Hovendens, a family of prosperous settlers. Here he learnt the ways of and manners of an English gentleman. By the time Hugh was 30, he was defending the Queen's subjects in the Pale. By the age of 40, Elizabeth was calling him a creature of our own.
O'Neill is one of the great enigmas of Irish history, and in some respects he is seen as having a split personality, somebody who at the same time is English and at the same time as he is Irish. He is fully conversant in both cultures, the Irish culture of the time and the English culture of the time, and that actually gives him great facility as a politician.
Elizabeth summoned O'Neill to Dublin Castle to explain his inability to quash O'Donnell. His hand now forced, Hugh O'Neill slipped out of the capital, returned to Ulster, and joined his son-in-law in a rebellion that became known as the 9 Years' War. But father-in-law and son-in-law were very different people. O'Neill was as cautious as O'Donnell was impetuous, and even as they cemented their unique working alliance, the very nature of the conflict with England was being shaped by events in Europe.
Well, 400 years ago, the world order was very different to the one with which we're familiar today. To begin with, the most powerful country in the world was Spain, the Spain of Philip II and Philip III. That was the greatest political power. It was also the greatest religious power.
A huge naval fleet and a missionary zeal for gold meant the Spanish Empire was the first on which the sun never set. It stretched from Eastern Europe right around the globe via the silver mines of South America to the Philippines, which the Spanish monarch had named after himself in a Catholic universe.
At this stage, at the end of the 16th century, Philip has been king for quite a long time, Philip II, and he's an old man, and he's a very sick man. However, he's also the most powerful king in the whole world, so he has a number of political obligations, not just in Spain, but all over Europe. Remember, the Spanish are in charge of the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. They have a rebellion going on there. They're very, very influential also in the Italian peninsula and, of course, in the New World. Now, that brings them into conflict, if you like, or into tension with practically everybody else in Europe, particularly at this stage, England and Queen Elizabeth.
With the state coffers all but empty, Philip's army in the Netherlands was not being paid. They ran amok, taking their frustration out on the people of Antwerp. It was a mass slaughter. In desperation, the Dutch Protestants turned to the world's only Protestant leader, Queen Elizabeth. This put England, a minor European player, on a collision course with the two major powers of the day, the Spanish Empire and the Church of Rome. And the flames of that global conflict were being fanned by the growing rebellion in Ireland. O'Neill and O'Donnell had driven the English back from Ulster. Connacht had joined them in open revolt, and they were busy stoking the fires in Leinster and Munster. More and more, they ruled the open country. The enemy was confined to isolated garrison towns, and these outposts needed to be supplied. In the spring of 1595, the Gaelic Confederate armies fell on a column of Elizabeth's troops who were on their way to relieve the garrison at Monaghan town. When at Clontibret, strung out, exposed and vulnerable, O'Neill's army picked off the English, one by one. This was not open battle. This was guerrilla warfare, and the Dublin government was horrified at the audacity of the Irish. But the Earl of Tyrone hadn't finished. He was inaugurated the O'Neill, the chief Gaelic lord. Taking the band title was more than just an act of defiance. It was a declaration of independence. Hugh O'Neill, the darling rogue of Elizabeth's court, was declared a traitor. If caught, he faced the kind of death handed out 8 years earlier to another Gaelic chief.
His members and bowels burned in the fire, his heart taken out. Then was his head stricken off, and his body quartered.
Elizabeth was extremely pissed off when she had to declare O'Neill a traitor. She'd held off for about a year in making that decision. She was considered O'Neill to be her man in Ulster, the Queen's O'Neill. She had established them there. She had, as she said, raised them from the dust. He considered otherwise, of course. He considered that he had achieved his authority in Ulster by what he called scratching in the earth.
But even as Elizabeth's government was baying for blood, the two sides were in negotiation. Knowing he was in a position of strength, O'Neill kept upping his demands, but slowly the two sides were moving close to a peace agreement when, in the spring of 1596, an envoy from Philip's court landed on a Donegal beach. Years earlier, Philip of Spain had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary Tudor, the last Catholic Queen of England. After her death, Philip, wanting to keep England under Spanish influence, had proposed to Elizabeth, but she would not take a husband. England would not have a foreign king, and certainly not a Catholic one. So Philip tried other means to neuter Elizabeth. In 1588, he sent a mighty armada to overthrow her. But, harassed by Drake, the Spanish were pushed away from the English coast and were pounded to death by rough seas off the coast of Donegal. Some 6,000 Spaniards drowned, and those who made shore fared little better. Most were rounded up and killed by both the English and the Irish, including, in a show of loyalty, Hugh O'Neill. Now, 8 years later, this time with O'Neill's support, Philip wanted to try again. He promised the Irish Confederates another mighty armada. This one would first take Ireland before moving on to dethrone Elizabeth. O'Neill took a momentous decision. He reneged on the peace treaty with England and committed himself and the Confederacy to an alliance with Spain. Hugh O'Neill sent a special message to King Philip at the Escorial.
Since, to our great and unspeakable detriment, we have experienced acts of injustice and wrongdoing on the part of those whom the ruler of England used to send to us, We pray and beseech your majesty to designate as king over this island someone who is known to you, who is completely honourable and gifted for your majesty's own benefit and that of the Commonwealth of Ireland.
Queen Elizabeth of England is nearing her end, and she will die in 1603. So the question of the succession in England is very, very topical. Now remember, Elizabeth never married, so there's no direct Tudor successor. So Philip is very, very concerned that a more pro-Spanish succession would occur in England, and he wanted to put his own daughter, Isabella, on the throne of England.
Philip II's enormous gamble had been a total disaster, and for the third time in his reign, Spain was bankrupt. The news came as a crushing blow to the Confederates, who had pinned their hopes for victory on Spanish aid. They now would have to carry on the war with nothing more from Philip than words of support. Among the English planters, the failed Armada simply whipped up more rumours of invasion fleets and papal plots. Siege mentality set in, and the settlers armed themselves and prepared for the worst. On August the 24th, 1598, a 5,000-strong force of Elizabeth's soldiers was crossing the Ulster Blackwater at the Yellow Ford. They were on their way to resupply yet another English garrison when O'Neill and O'Donnell's armies descended on them. This time, though, the Gaelic lords were ruthless. The English were cut down in their thousands.
Well, the Battle of the Yellow Ford was the greatest victory the Irish ever won in arms against England. Basically, England's position after the Yellow Ford was extremely difficult indeed, and the Irish were in the ascendant all over Ireland.
Fueled by the Confederate victory, rebellion spread like wildfire across the country. The Munster plantation was overthrown. English colonial rule was all but crushed, and Elizabeth's once glorious reign was now beset with problems. O'Neill was anxious to press home his advantage, but he knew that he could never take the cities. His was a guerrilla army. They had few weapons and no siege cannon. He still needed Spanish aid and sent word of his great victory over the English to Philip Feathers in this specially built schoolroom. But disastrously for the Gaelic chiefs, the new king had inherited a bankrupt state, and he wasn't in a position to help. To add to O'Neill's troubles, Elizabeth, faced with the prospect of losing Ireland, had just landed 16,000 men and 1,300 horses on the east coast. This was the largest army ever assembled in Ireland. At the head of this mighty fighting force was the man who had recently torched the Spanish town of Cadiz. Ireland's new Lord Lieutenant was Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. Devereux arrived in Ireland with the cheers of his countrymen still ringing in his ears. On his departure, Londoners had lined the streets 2 deep for 4 miles, cheering the victor of Cadiz and calling down the blessings of heaven upon him. His one military success had turned Essex into a hero, but his public popularity and his arrogance had driven a wedge between the young heartthrob and Queen Elizabeth. For Elizabeth was a monarchy built on popularity, and she didn't take kindly to sharing the limelight with the arrogant young Earl. "I have beaten Knollys and Mountjoy in the council," Essex boasted, "and by God, I will beat Tyrone in the field." However, he did nothing of the sort. Essex wandered around Ireland, avoiding Ulster. In 6 months, he spent £300,000 and lost 3/4 of his men to desertion and disease. Elizabeth was losing patience with her tarnished favourite. It's June the 29th, 1599, and Philip III has sent an envoy to meet O'Neill and O'Donnell. It wasn't that he had finally listened to the Irish pleas for help, but rather, after the sacking of Cadiz, Spain was now fearful of more English attacks. Philip now saw in Ireland an opportunity to distract Elizabeth and her armies. A window of opportunity had briefly opened, and O'Neill was anxious to capitalise on it. Hugh O'Neill now presented his war with Elizabeth as a Catholic crusade. Ireland was united behind him. The country was a tinderbox of revolution. All it needed to explode was Spanish help to light the fuse. The envoy's report to Philip III had O'Neill's fingerprints all over it.
A Spanish aid to Ireland will save our holy faith. Besides, by aiding Ireland, His Majesty will at the very least achieve the same effect as Queen Elizabeth does by aiding the Dutch rebels. This is a matter whose importance we ought to rate highly, and to which we ought to attend with great care and diligence.
Philip III took the bait. He promised to have a Spanish army in Ireland within 6 months, even if he had to pay for it himself. The pressure was now on. O'Neill needed to get Essex off his back, and he needed to win over the Catholics of Ireland. If the Spanish invasion was to be successful, solid support from all the Gaelic chiefs and the Old English gentry was needed. The pressure was also on Essex. Elizabeth ordered him to attack O'Neill, but his mighty force of 16,000 was now down to under 4,000 men. And his priorities had shifted. He no longer wanted O'Neill's head on a spike. He wanted an ally. The two men met midstream, not far from Louth town, and for half an hour they talked out of earshot of their prying lieutenants. What they discussed, you will never know for certain, but it's probable that Essex was acting as kingmaker. With Elizabeth's reign coming to an end, he was anxious to benefit whoever should gain the throne. Buying peace in Ireland would be quite a trophy. A ceasefire was agreed. Essex got what he wanted, the opportunity of a speedy return to court, and O'Neill had succeeded in buying a breathing space until the promised Spanish army arrived to help secure victory. Essex left Ireland that winter, and 3 years later led an abortive coup d'etat against Elizabeth. For his trouble, he was taken to the Tower of London and executed. It took 3 blows of the axe to sever his head.
During O'Neill's negotiations with the government, he had raised the matter of religion on a number of occasions, basically to up the ante. He demanded, first of all, religious toleration in Ulster, and then religious toleration throughout Ireland in those negotiations. However, when Essex left Ireland basically with his tail behind his legs, O'Neill decided to go for broke.
O'Neill now called into play the powerful forces of religion and nationalism. He argued that Irishness and Catholicism were synonymous, and it was the duty of Irish Catholics to oppose the Protestant English. In the winter of 1600, Hugh O'Neill left his stronghold of Dungannon Castle and headed south. His new argument had got short shrift from the Catholics of the Pale. He now hoped, at the very least, to convince the Catholic lords of Munster to unite under the Cross of Rome and the Red Hand of Ulster. The support of people like Lord Barry in Cork would be essential.
For the maintenance of the Catholic religion, also for expelling our enemies from the continual treachery and oppressions used towards this our poor country, we have undertaken a journey to visit those places which have as yet not joined in the godly enterprise. we thought it fit to write to your lordship to add your helping hand in the accomplishing of our said enterprise.
But O'Neill could not demand Barry's support. He would have to rely on more worldly methods of persuasion. If his arguments failed, O'Neill could always call on his private army.
Meet us at Glanmire on Thursday next, or so soon as ye may, with a good pledge for performance. Otherwise, we shall follow that course of action which shall be little to your liking.
The response from Barry's court castle was short and to the point.
You shall understand that I hold my lordships and my lands immediately under God and her majesty, which service and tenure none may disperse with all but the true possession of the crown of England, being now our sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth. And though ye, by some overweighing imaginations, have declined from your dutiful allegiance unto her highness, yet I have settled myself never to forsake her.
O'Neill delivered on his threat, burned Barry's lands, and razed the nearby towns. Back in Ulster, O'Neill wrote to Pope Clement saying he was now the champion of Catholic freedom in Ireland. He wanted papal dispensation to turn his struggle into a holy war. He wanted nothing less than church support for his religious crusade against England and its heretic queen. In 1570, Pope Pius V had proclaimed Queen Elizabeth's death sentence. Whosoever sends her out of the world with the pious intention of doing God's service not only does not sin, but gains merit. But the papal bull didn't apply in Ireland. O'Neill argued that it should. This would automatically excommunicate all of Elizabeth's supporters in Ireland and bring dispensations to those who sided with the Confederates. In other words, the Old English, or Loyal Irish, like Lord Barry, who were Catholic but still supported Elizabeth, would have no choice but to fall in behind his banner.
Now remember also that O'Neill has suffered some very, very strong negative propaganda in Rome at the papal court. And this has been brought to Rome by what we call members of the Old English elite in Ireland. Most of them priests, and many of them very well-placed priests, who've reservations about O'Neill as a Gaelic lord. And many of the Old English, although they were Catholics, had actually gained from the suppression of the monasteries and were in possession of property. Now they were afraid that in an O'Neill victory, this property was going to be taken from them and redistributed.
O'Neill's agents in Rome set to work, but Pope Clement had other ideas. He was wary of Spain and the growth in Spanish power. The last thing Clement wanted was a Spanish Ireland. O'Neill's Catholic crusade would get no help from Rome.
Why not get away from it all with Super Value? Thanks to Getaway Hotel Breaks, we're giving you the chance to relax in one of over 150 hotels around Ireland. There are 2-night weekend or 3-night midweek breaks available, and all for the fantastic price of just £69 per person sharing when you collect 80 tokens. Just pick up a collector's card and book today using our in-store leaflet to choose the location for your relaxing break. Getaway Hotel Breaks, only at Super Value. That's shopping as it should be.
As we all know, looking after your little ones is vital. Because it's only by giving them the most tender, crisp and tastiest there is that you can be sure they'll grow up full of beans. Or should we say, sweet corn. Ho, ho, ho.
Green Giant.
There's no such thing as an average family. so don't serve them an average pasta meal. Ragu Original Bolognese, not your average pasta sauce.
Why don't I jump aboard and keep you company, eh? You care for a ride, then?
Not really, thank you.
I see you like the really rich.
I like Kenko really rich, yes. It's not only rich, it has depth and superb taste. Ciao.
Fair dues. I'll catch you next time. Lovely evening, ladies.
Kenko. Real coffee taste in an instant.
Something new from Vileda?
The new Super Mop with a 20% larger cleaning zone that cleans even the most stubborn dirt.
A mop can clean that?
The new Super Mop can, thanks to its unique Vileda Microfiber Plus. Good luck.
There are more important things than worrying about dried-on dirt with the new Super Mop from Vileda. You can get your floors clean and dedicate yourself to the things you really enjoy. The new Vileda Super Mop system.
You want a Beamish?
Yep, of course I'm having a Beamish.
Good man.
Beamish. Always the same. That's why it's different.
Detox wipes safely kill harmful bacteria such as Salmonella and E. coli and are bleach-free and leave no taint or odour. Life demands Detox.
Use sellotape to remove pet hair from clothes, carpets or furniture.
More good advice from the Personal Care line.
Washing at 60? Stop. Switch down to 40. And the green light is on for energy saving. Our environment needs green.
In the summer of 1600, to ensure the province's loyalty, Hugh O'Neill left behind a 2,000-strong force of his men in Munster. He then returned to Ulster and prepared for the arrival of the promised Spanish army. But winter came and went, and there was no sign of Philip's armada. When yet another Spanish envoy arrived with nothing but words, the two Hughs were far from pleased. It was now nearly a year since they had been promised an army within 6 months, and in no uncertain terms, O'Neill reminded the envoy of Philip II's words when he reneged on his peace treaty with the English.
Continue to expel the English, and you can count on my help. Now where is the help?
Munster was as loyal to O'Neill as he could hope. His soldiers were in place, and now he was being asked to continue the war for another 5 months in expectation of an army from Spain. This was as far as O'Neill and O'Donnell could guarantee to pay their men, and as long as they could hope to hold together their strained alliance. But, ever the politician, O'Neill sent his son Henry to Madrid as a token of his continuing loyalty to the Spanish crown, with the granting of his own flesh and blood as hostage. There was now no way the Gaelic chief could renege on his deal with Spain. It was now Elizabeth's turn to push her advantage, and she did so in the shape of a new Lord Deputy. He was from an ancient aristocratic house which had fallen on hard times. A natty dresser who loved fine clothes and had a fetish for shiny boots. He was Elizabeth's new man in Ireland, Lord Deputy Mountjoy. He was pedantic and humourless, but he was smart. Mountjoy landed a garrison behind the Gaelic lines in Lough Foyle and wasted no time in taking on O'Neill. Meanwhile, his deputy Carew recaptured Munster. O'Neill was now cut off and surrounded, but his luck was changing. Philip III was good to his word, and a Spanish army of over 5,000 men was massing in Lisbon, ready to sail to Ireland. Philip was determined to succeed where his father had failed. He would follow in the footsteps. Men were less than pleased to be sailing into the land of rain and savages. Within 10 days of leaving Lisbon, the 33 ships that made up the Armada had Ireland in sight, and that's when the first disaster struck. The storm clouds closed in and the fleet was scattered. 6 of the ships were driven back to Spain, and on board were most of the arms and ammunition. De la Guilla and 2,500 of his men managed to make landfall at Kinsale, but they got no support from the Catholic Munster chiefs and were soon surrounded by nearly 12,000 of Mountjoy's troops. Their access to the sea cut off by enemy ships, the Spanish army that had come to liberate Ireland was under siege. The Gaelic stronghold of Ulster couldn't be further away from Kinsale, and the chances of both armies meeting, let alone taking on and beating the English, looked remote.
The Spanish attitude to the Irish in the 16th century was radically very bad, in terms that we had a hard tradition of Irishmen as a society very apart from the rest of Europe. So the Águila was all the time complaining, what I'm doing here, and I need help from Spain. We are alone in Kinsale. We don't know if these Irishmen, are they coming from the north? We don't know nothing about it. So what are we doing here in Ireland?
With the Spanish in the south, which was now hostile territory, Hugh O'Neill was faced with a terrible dilemma. To head to Kinsale would leave Ulster open to invasion. To stay put would see the Spaniards worn down and defeated. And if he did go to Kinsale, what then? His troops would have to face the English in open battle without the support of the Munster chiefs.
Well, the main support base for the war effort in Ireland was, of course, in Ulster. Munster had been very equivocal about supporting O'Neill. In fact, lots of the clergy, the Catholic clergy in Munster, are preaching against the Spanish and against supporting them. And they're doing this right through the Kinsale campaign. And O'Neill, though he's very angered by this, can really do nothing to stop it.
Within 3 weeks of hearing that De la Guilla had landed, O'Neill had made his decision. He would march on Kinsale. This is what O'Donnell was waiting for. His army stormed south, marching the length of Ireland in the dead of winter. In the middle of the night, they slipped past the English sent to intercept them by marching 40 miles over the frozen passes of the Slieve Felim Mountains and down into Munster. O'er many a river bridged with ice, o'er many a vale with snowdrifts dumb, past quaking fen and precipice, the princes of the north are come. Lo, those are they who year by year rolled back the tide of England's war. Rejoice, Kinsale, thy help is near, that wondrous winter march is o'er. But the game was far from over. English warships on a routine patrol came across 6 Spanish galleons landing reinforcements in Castlehaven. In the ensuing battle, 1 Spanish ship was lost, but 2 English vessels never made it back to Kinsale. Mountjoy knew the 9 Years' War was entering its final and most dangerous phase. The arrival of the Spanish reinforcements and the Ulster armies had roused the previously loyal Irish. All of Munster west of Cork was now declared for Spain. Mountjoy tightened his grip on Kinsale. He recaptured Rincurran Fort, then Castle Park, forcing the Spaniards into the walled town of Kinsale. He then took command of the hills surrounding the town and unleashed a rain of cannon fire. It was a deadly error. O'Neill went on the offensive, surrounding the English and cutting off their supply lines. Outnumbered and trapped between the Spanish and Gaelic Confederate armies, the besiegers had become the besieged. The weather turned wretched. Mountjoy's men were up to their knees in mud. Every day, up to 40 soldiers would drop dead at their posts, while scores more would desert. The best part of 6,000 English soldiers were killed not by the Gaelic Confederates, but by the elements. Most were left to rot where they fell. Burying them was a waste of energy the English could not afford. O'Neill's strategy was paying off. He knew his forces were not versed in open warfare and preferred to let hunger and disease do his work for him. But the pressure was building. Before he left Spain, De la Guilla had been promised massive local support in Ireland. The campaign would be short and sharp. Yet here he was, still besieged, nearly 3 months after he had landed. His men wrapped in rags to keep out the Irish winter, sleeping on the damp, cold floors. O'Donnell's natural inclination was always to attack. His army had travelled south without cattle and was now slowly starving to death. They had no shelter whatsoever, sleeping night after night in sodden clothes and water-soaked ditches. The situation couldn't continue. Letters smuggled from De la Guilla were equally emphatic. It was time to attack. Against his better judgment, O'Neill relented. They would engage the English at sunrise. From the very start, the battle was a disaster for the Irish. On the march into Kinsale, O'Neill and O'Donnell's armies got separated.
The battle itself was all over in about an hour. Once the English cavalry attacked, the Irish cavalry fled, and the Irish foot was surrounded and massacred. The battle is quite ironic in a sense in that O'Neill had managed to train a very effective infantry army, and that was the most professional part of his army. But in fact, the part of his army which hadn't been modernised, the cavalry, were the force which let O'Neill down on the day.
His men.
No communication between the Spaniards fixed at Kinsale in the town and and with the main Irish army. But we can't say that it was a mistake from one of the parts, because Irishmen complaining all the time about De la Guilla's attitude was really awful, but De la Guilla and the rest of the Spaniards complaining with the Irish, because the English cavalry just in a minute finished with the Irish infantry. So the Spaniards say this is a medieval thing, how to do the war. So we can understand why in a few minutes everything was lost.
The rout of the Confederate armies was complete. Around 1,200 Irish were killed as they fled the battlefield. Another 800 were wounded and probably died later. Depending on whose report you believe, the English lost either 3 men or just the 1. The English fired a volley in victory. This De la Guilla took as the Irish signal to attack. He sallied out to help, only to see the Spanish colours being carried by the English. He knew the land forces had been beaten and surrendered to Mountjoy.
In some respects, De la Guilla wasn't surprised at this result. He considered the Irish inadequate as a military force, and he always considered them barbarous and undisciplined.
I think the defeat at Kinsale was extremely significant for Ireland in general, and particularly for the Gaelic order. It was a military defeat, first of all, for O'Neill and for the Confederates in the north. Secondly, it was, of course, an English victory, partial but still quite a convincing one. And thirdly, it confirmed the Spaniards in the dangers, if you like, of mounting an expedition to Ireland. A very, very strong body of opinion in Spain, especially military circles, against military intervention in Ireland because of the huge risks. So these fears were realised, if you like, by the events at Kinsale.
With Mountjoy's victory, the Tudor monarchy had virtually achieved its cherished aim of quashing the rebellious Irish. With the heads of the Gaelic nobility adorning the walls of Dublin Castle, the total conquest of Ireland was inevitable. This was particularly hard on the Munster chiefs like O'Sullivan Bear, who, until the arrival of the Spanish at Castlehaven, had been loyal to Elizabeth. Now the Crown forces wreaked a terrible vengeance. Shortly after Kinsale, Red Hugh O'Donnell fled to Spain, but his exile was to be a brief one. In 1602, he died in the castle of Semenchus. Hugh O'Neill returned to his seat of power in Ulster, and Mountjoy followed. In a deliberate act of provocation, the Lord Deputy smashed the inaugural seat of the O'Neills. Sovereignty of the Gaelic lords was no more. Mountjoy then sacked Dungannon Castle, and like a common criminal, Hugh O'Neill was on the run. The English victory was now complete. It had taken over 400 years to quell the rebellious Irish, but in the end, Elizabeth had succeeded, but at a price. The Queen had brought her kingdom to the brink of bankruptcy, spending over £2 million on her Irish campaign, and in the end, she never got what she wanted. She never got Hugh O'Neill. On the 24th of March 1603, Queen Elizabeth died, and 6 days later, Hugh O'Neill submitted to Lord Deputy Mountjoy. King James of Scotland took the English throne, and Great Britain was born. But even though O'Neill had managed to negotiate a favourable surrender with the new king, his position was untenable, and he and the rest of Ulster's native nobility disappeared into the night in what became known as the Flight of the Earls.
The Flight of the Earls of 1607 has never really fully been explained. It's not clear whether the English were conspiring against O'Neill, or O'Neill had actually been continuing to conspire with the Spanish and was afraid that he had been discovered. But certainly it is aptly described as a flight because they left so very suddenly. They gathered up what few belongings they had and left the country.
Hugh O'Neill headed for Spain, where he was sure of a warm reception. But his ship was forced by bad weather to land in northern France, and he was shunted off to the Low Countries and then across the Alps into Italy. The Spanish had made peace with the English, and the Irishman was now an embarrassment. Eventually, Hugh O'Neill was offered sanctuary in, of all places, Rome, and it was here at the Franciscan Church of San Pietro that he died, a broken man, in 1616. He never gave up fighting. He had continuously plotted a return to Ireland at the head of a mighty Catholic army, or even as part of an army led by one of his sons. But he outlived all of them, including young Henry, who had risen to the rank of commander in the Spanish army. But it was not to be. His homeland of Ulster was ravaged. Famine killed thousands of his people. Then followed the Plantation of Ulster, where lands of the Gaelic lords were confiscated and planted by English and Scots Protestants. The most Gaelic province in Ireland thus became, in the end, the most British. Kinsale, then, was a turning point in world history. After the English victory in Ireland, the sea routes to the Americas were controlled not by King Philip of Spain, but by King James in London. For Spain, too, Kinsale was a turning point. marking the beginning of the end of its empire, while Britannia went on to colonize North America and rule over an empire greater than anything the world had ever seen. As for Ireland, Kinsale marked the end of the road for the great Gaelic aristocrats, the completion of the English conquest, and the establishment of Protestant ascendancy in church and state. To this day, Ireland is still tossed in the wake of Hugh O'Neill and the Battle of Kinsale.
O'Neill was a very capable military commander. He was a ruthless political operator who killed off rivals. He was an adept politician. However, I suppose his legacy to Ireland is slightly different in that he left a legacy of faith in fatherland, the Catholic religion, and connected with the nationality of Irishness. He also, and I think is an important aspect to him, he had what we might call agency. He actually determined power plays. He actually determined the strategy of wars. The Irish in the wars against England weren't necessarily hapless victims of colonialism. They too could be players.
Camden, a contemporary English historian, wrote of Hugh O'Neill what could be written about most every Irish leader that followed him. He was born either to the very great good or the great hurt of Ireland.
And next Monday, Once and Again is back at the usual time of 9:30, right here on RTE1.
Question. Okay.